We're so honored to have Margarita join us. Margarita also is part of the Indigenous Survivance channel panel yesterday, which just was one of the most spectacular things like I've ever seen. Listening to Margarita and Johnny from Kupu and Benno from Fab Lab Lena share their perspectives was so important. I literally just was enthralled the entire time they were speaking. And Margarita is going to speak to you all now. She leads an incredible organization called Tero. It's funny, we've had this track, Guardianship of Ecosystems, for a few years at the BioSummit. And if you look at the Tero website, which I encourage you all to do either now or later, literally the tagline of her organization is securing indigenous guardianship of vital ecosystems. So, it was just this synchronous, harmonious match. And Margarita was also a director's fellow at the Media Lab at MIT. So I've had the real privilege of being able to interact with Margarita over the past couple of years through that as well. But Margarita, we're so honored to have you join us. Margarita is going to speak now for about 25 minutes or so. And then she will also be helping to lead another session in the Guardianship of Ecosystems track, which is going to be happening this afternoon, of course, in the Chloroplast from 2 to 7 p.m. And Margarita will be leading that session at from 2 to 3 p.m., also with some colleagues from Tero and beyond. So with that, everybody, can you all join me in giving some snaps, some love, some claps to Margarita Mora? Margarita, thank you so much for being here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much for the invite, and I have been listening to all of the panelists this morning, and it has been fantastic. So thank you to all for inspiring me. Also, I have to say the yoga came just in time, so thanks, Ravati, for that. I want to share with you my screen, so if you give me 1 second. Great. I want to start this session by acknowledging that, most of what remains of nature is in the hands of indigenous peoples and local communities. These are the areas with the highest value to humanity. They are the areas with the highest diversity of plants and animals in the world, the largest carbon stocks, and these are areas that are key for fresh water cycles. People living in these areas have the right to determine the future that they want. And our job is to stand in solidarity with them and support what they have chosen to do. In the last century, because it's already 2020, the word conservation was streamlined around the world. And conservationists focused so much on nature. And in many cases, they didn't recognize indigenous people's rights, their knowledge systems, or their contributions to humanity. Instead, conservation was achieved by forcing people out, fencing protected areas, changing ways of lives, manipulating communities, and not acknowledging the owners and users of these lands and waters created resentment. Not good for the future of our planet and not good for the future of our people. To share a bit about myself, I spent a lot of time in the countryside of Ecuador when growing up. And as a grown-up, I also spent a lot of time in the countryside as well. And one of the things that I was really interested in doing since I can remember was figuring out ways in which people living in the countryside, whether indigenous or local communities, could have a better life and at the same time could maintain that close relationship to nature, right? And in 2004, I was very lucky to be part of a team that started building a model on how to establish more equitable relationships between conservation organizations and indigenous peoples and local communities. And I spent almost 14 years focusing solely on this, working not only in Ecuador, but first throughout Latin America, and then in Africa and in Asia. And a few years ago, I came to realize that this was actually not enough. It took me time to realize that despite having really good maps of almost everything, we were ignoring a crucial map, and that is the map of human identity. And it also led me to think that our main problem nowadays is a problem of values. values that have disappeared from this modern world, and particularly that disappeared when we lost that deep connection to place that has been part of our history as humanity. The good news is that those values are not entirely lost around the world. Indigenous peoples hold those values deeply, and we could rebuild those values as well with their help. And to do that, we need to start recognizing that those places that we only see as forests or as rangelands or as oceans are much more than that. These are not only the places where people gather food or find medicines or construction materials. These are actually the places where epic myths and stories are told by grandmothers. These are the places where mothers take their children to teach them about their culture, about their spirituality, about their past and their future. These are the places where daughters and sons belong to before they are born. And that is something really hard for us to sometimes realize in this modern world. These are places where many people, before they are born, already know what they are going to be doing, what they are going to be leading, how their relationship to place will be. In reality, these are the places of their ancestors, the places that are inhabited by non-human beings that are linked to their history and to their knowledge systems. These are the places where they find wisdom and maintain their connection to the spiritual world. Indigenous peoples account for about 5% of the global population, but uphold vast areas not because of conservation. And I just want to make that very clear. It is not conservation what drives Indigenous peoples managing and protecting 80% of the healthiest ecosystems in the planet. They do that because they have a common identity and value systems that are really linked to place. And this is one of the most dual aspects of humanity, as identity passes from grandparents to the great-grandchildren that probably they will never meet, right? These are the places that if we start changing our way of thinking, it is not that Indigenous peoples own these places. It is the places where they belong, where they establish reciprocal relationships with all of the beings that surround them, because they know that if they don't do that, they are not going to survive, right? And these places persist because time-earned knowledge systems and place-anchored technologies result in what we call guardianship. And guardianship means the right to belong to those places, the acceptance of the responsibility to manage and maintain those places in the long term, and the capacity to sustain vital natural system within a collective territory. Reality is that the fate of all of us, humans, depends on Indigenous peoples defending these thriving territories. They are the ones that maintain humanities, different ways of humanities, different ways of knowing and being, and that ensure the health and the well-being of the planet as a whole. To give you a couple of examples, I would always see the Pacific Islands and the Pacific Ocean, and I would see so much water. And I would see these tiny islands. And it took me as well a bit to recognize that those are not tiny indigenous island nations. They are actually large indigenous ocean nations, right? If we start thinking about the Pacific Islands, the Pacific as a whole, the ocean covers 10% of the planet's surface, and it holds 70% of all the tuna catch that we eat. So if you like sushi, great probabilities of the tuna coming from the Pacific Ocean. And this is the place where indigenous people learn to navigate and move from one island to the other way before we had the technology that we have nowadays, thousands of years ago, right? Using their knowledge, reading the stars, reading the waves, reading the animals that were around them, reading the currents. And they were able and are still able to move from one island to the next without getting lost. That is traditional knowledge, and that is transfer of knowledge among different generations. And this is not something that you can read or learn in a book. This is something that you have to practice since the time you are born. In many of these islands, indigenous people still maintain the traditional coastal management systems, and they still maintain those deep relationships to the mountains within the islands. And these systems were refined for thousands of years, right? Just to give you an example, those systems are still in place. And for that reason, the Solomon Islands, about a year ago, maybe a bit more than a year ago, decided to pledge the protection of all islands and all forests above 400 meters high, because they know that they are not only these incredible places in terms of unique biodiversity or key for water sources, but they have this deep cultural relationship to the Solomon Islanders. They are the places where their culture was born, where their creation myths are established, and where their spirituality thrives. Without those sky islands, indigenous people would lose part of who they are. To give you another example, I work a lot in the northern part of the Amazon, and this is the largest forested indigenous managed landscape in the world, right? To give you a sense of the scales, it is of the size of 3 Californias. And there are more than 2,000 indigenous territories that belong to more than 400 indigenous peoples in this area. And last year I was visiting one of the territories, and it was so fantastic to talk with our indigenous colleagues and them sharing these things that sometimes for the Western world are difficult to comprehend, but sharing that they have this collective territory, they are so committed to their forest, and they are not committed to the forest because they like the woods, right? They are committed because their culture is so tied to it. In the forest, they have their sacred source, and everyone, men and women, have to receive this sacred source at some point of their life, because that is what guides them. That is what tells them what is their future and how they fit well within their community. And without that sacred force revealing to them, they are lost forever, right? And with this, I want to highlight that indigenous peoples in the Amazon and in many places around the world are currently so threatened. They are not only threatened by mining, expansion and invasion of their territories, or by cattle ranching, or by large soy production farms. They are being threatened also by governments that are trying to keep taking over their territories and eliminating their rights, right? Their right, the basic right for survival. And this is something that I want to call your attention to, because it is a dire moment that many people in the Amazon are facing right now. If they disappear, their knowledge disappear, and these places that we all depend on as humans for survival are going to disappear as well. As David mentioned at the beginning, I am working for an organization that it is called Tero. I am the managing director of partnerships, and I have been there since before the organization was established. And I want to highlight that through our work with indigenous peoples, what I really want to come across is that great pressures are threatening them, and they are threatening the guardianship of indigenous territories. And indigenous peoples all around the world are seeking now for recognition, partnerships, and support. Highlighting that partnership doesn't mean imposing your way of thinking or your way of learning or your way of knowing, but it is actually honoring and respecting and standing in solidarity with indigenous peoples and being able to listen very, very carefully and attentively to what they have to say, because they are the ones that know these places the most, and they have the right to determine the future that they want to have. They have their self-determination right. And so if you want to establish partnerships with them, you have to have an open mind and an open heart, and be able to let them lead and you follow, right? It also means that it takes time to develop trustful relationships. And it also takes humility, acknowledging that it really doesn't matter how long you spend in these places. You are never going to fully understand what is going on and what are the relationships between the people and the territory. So at Tero, what I am doing now is helping the organization build this type of equitable relationships in different parts of the world. But we don't need only one organization such as Tero doing this. If we want to succeed, we need hundreds of organizations working in a different way with indigenous peoples. I have a 6-year-old boy, and from the moment that he was born, I have been asking myself if he will have the privilege to learn from people that see the world in a very different way, with place anchor identity, so that they know really where they belong, and with a different way of thinking and knowing, acknowledging that for indigenous peoples, the word conservation does not exist. And it does not exist because they know that they do not own nature, but that they need to have a reciprocal relationship with nature for everyone to survive. And this has taken me to ask constantly myself, what kind of ancestors will we be? And this is not a new question. Indigenous peoples have been asking this question for thousands of years. And really, my hope is that if we start asking this question to ourselves on a regular basis, maybe we can move from thinking of our well-being solely in terms of what we can take, but also in terms of well-being equally defined by what we are leaving behind. And maybe that is a way where we can have a healthier, better, more equitable world, which is what many of us are looking for. If you want to have more of a deeper interaction this afternoon with some of our Indigenous partners and colleagues, I invite you to the session on Indigenous Guardianships that it is going to take place in a couple of hours. Thank you very much.
Can we give some snaps, some claps, and some deep, deep love and appreciation and gratitude to Margarita? Yeah, Margarita, I think I don't know if you've been following in the chat, but again, I think people are incredibly, I know I'm personally incredibly moved right now, and I think so many are right now as well. We actually have a few minutes for some questions, so why don't we shift into some question and answer with everybody here? Again, I think it's just deep gratitude to you, Margarita, for spending so much time with us. So if you would like to ask Margarita a question, go ahead and put your hand raise up, and you can give a blue hand raise or say something in the chat, and then we can have you ask. So please go ahead and start. Margarita, I guess, one question I have for you, because you do have this session, you do have another hour from 2 to 3 o'clock Eastern time. So we're really excited about that. Do you want to share a little bit more about the guests that you've invited? Because I think that's really, really beautiful as well, the folks that you've invited. And actually, I can share my screen and give a little bit of an advertisement in a way for what'll happen this afternoon. So if folks are seeing my screen right now, this is the 2 to 3 o'clock session.
Yeah, so I have invited 3 Indigenous colleagues. Sharon Austin is an Akawayo woman from Guyana, and actually she leads our work at Tero in the Northern Amazon. So she has a lot of experience and really interesting and insightful perspectives on Indigenous guardianship. I have also invited Yupta Itoewaki, which is a leader from the Guayana people of Suriname. I can imagine that none of you have heard of the Guayana people of Suriname. And she leads this local NGO called Mulokot that is really working towards ensuring that the Guayana people follow their self-determined vision and their own path right? Without external pressures that might influence outcomes that it is not really what they want. And finally, I have invited Tiyua Uyuncar, who is the representative of the Achuar Nation of Ecuador. He hopefully will be able to fully connect because he told me that he had an emergency and had to go to one of the Achuar communities in the jungle, but that he thought that things were going to work well. He's an amazing leader, and the Achuar people have this very deep connection to their territory and what it means in terms of the forest. So I am sure that it is going to be an interesting conversation, particularly for people that are interested in learning more about indigenous perspectives.
Wonderful, Margarita. Yeah, we're just so honored to have your guest join us. I'm really looking forward to that. So I'm seeing a number of wonderful questions in the chat, and I can ask these for folks. I don't see any hand raises, so I'll just go ahead and ask the questions in the chat for you. So Dean is asking, how do we make an impact in our communities, but guided by this philosophy?
My question would be, what do you mean by communities? Your own, yeah. So
Good
that I can
question,
properly respond to the question.
Okay, so Dean, why don't you type that back into the chat and we can go from there. Amanda asks, what are some of the first ways you invite non-Indigenous folks to participate with Indigenous collaborators?
You know, I was sharing yesterday that it depends on the collaboration, and I am going to focus a bit on technology in this session because of where we are. And that is a big question. In regards to connecting Indigenous peoples and technologies, there has been a really rough history of Indigenous information being stolen and lack of acknowledgement, and them just finding out that things are being used in a way that sometimes they don't even want or expect it because it is not appropriate. And at the same time, technology can bring a lot of good things to Indigenous peoples, right? So what we at Tero are doing is organizing an event that it is called Techno-Indigenous, that it is going to be a recurring event probably twice per year with several follow-ups, so that we can start connecting Indigenous peoples and technologies willing to open their minds to different ways of working with Indigenous peoples, open to co-designing technology with them, and opening to having the time to do so, because it is not an easy task, right? It requires patience, it requires more patience, and it requires trust, right? Things might not go as quickly as you want, but at the same time, they might have an incredible impact, positive impact on the future of Indigenous peoples.
That's wonderful. And I'm just going to continue reading questions from the chat, but if you do want to ask Margarita live, if you do a blue hand raised, then we'll know. Oh, okay, Carolyn wants to ask live. Okay, can we unmute Carolyn? Okay, go ahead. Yeah, Carolyn, go ahead, Carolyn.
I'm so sorry. I think in host mode, I can't raise my hand. But Margarita, I'm so moved, and this concept of place anchor identity is like phenomenal. I'm the parent of a 21-year-old and 26-year-old, and I know people have a lot younger kids, and I am just wondering, what kind of conversations do you yourself have with your child about the lack of a possible intact future? It's a very painful conversation and issue to think about our children in this regard.
You know, I think that I am lucky because I am an optimist, right? So I think that there is opportunity of having that future. So I don't talk with him about it not happening. Though he reads the Lorax, and he cries every single time, right? Because the Lorax is actually the representation of that future.
That's right.
So I usually, in no COVID times, I am constantly traveling. And he's like, why are you leaving? Why are you leaving? And I'm like, remember the Lorax? We need to stand in solidarity with people that are doing everything for our future.
Thank you, Carolyn, for the question, and Margarita for the answer. So Rachel is asking about dialogues with the powers that be. So I'm assuming that means, dialogues with governments, authorities, potentially corporations, et cetera. How is Tero navigating those types of interactions?
We at Tero believe that our role is giving the space to Indigenous peoples to advocate for themselves and opening doors, right? Because I think that one of the things that it is really important to acknowledge that a lot of people, they speak on behalf of indigenous peoples, but they have their own voices and they have strong leaders and they have strong perspectives, and it is their right to be on the front line, right? So we at Tero, it is a battle, and believe me, sometimes the work is not easy because you are flooded with really bad news. At the same time, we at Tero support indigenous organizations that are doing policy and advocacy in different parts of the world, so that they have all the tools and supports that they need in order to advocate for themselves. In some cases, when they request our support on a specific thing so that we can open doors, we are always trying to open those doors. That's part of the solidarity and part of working alongside indigenous peoples.
That's wonderful. I'm seeing Dean from Dean Merowitz. You were clarifying your question, but Dean, feel free if you want to also unmute yourself, and you can just ask the question. Would you like to do that, or would you like me to read it? If Dean is there.
I managed to unmute myself, so I'm just gonna go for it.
Go for it, Dean.
I just want to know, because I'm in a very direct art college that is formal in the sense, and I want to just know, since we aren't science collaborative to the utmost extent as I hope we could be in the future, how can we here in a more art-based conservatory really like get this conversation going as to why it's so important without it being too derivative of science as to humanity?
That is a really big question. I personally, in my experience, have found that there are a lot of scientists that are interested in having this conversation because it opens a different perspective of what they can do really for the well-being of the, I know that everybody is looking for doing stuff that is good for humanity as a whole, right? But these conversations bring usually a different perspective, because a lot of people do not even realize that indigenous peoples are the ones that are maintaining the health of the planet. And they even realize less how in peril they are and how their rights are violated on a regular basis and how hard it is them, how of a constant fight they have to give in order to survive, right? So I think that opening spaces, again, I am really thankful to David for inviting me for this conversation, but I think that it is also really important to open spaces for indigenous peoples to talk themselves about these issues. And that is why we have done that this afternoon, inviting other colleagues and friends so that they can share their perspectives. And probably it is also a lot of the scientists themselves, if interested in this, pushing so that there are more conversations around these topics in some of the spaces where you are.
That's great. And Catherine is asking, do you have some literature on how indigenous tribes helped building the Amazon rainforest with a concept we now call agroforestry? So this is a request for resources.
Oof, you know, there are some beautiful books about agroforestry itself. No, I don't remember right now the name, but I will look for it. There is this archaeologist that is based on the University of Florida. His last name starts with a B, but my memory is failing me right now. And he has done a lot of research on how the Amazon was actually heavily populated, right? You have in the Amazon these areas that are called these terra preta, which is these very dark soils that are built by humans over use of through many centuries and thousands of years. They managed to ensure that parts of the Amazon were with good enough soils to produce enough food for enough people, right? When you go to the Amazon, there is this myth that the Amazon is just this forest, that it is uniform. The Amazon is huge. I tell you, only the northern part of the Amazon is 3 times California, and that is just the northern part of the Amazon, right? The Amazon is of the size, I was going to say something wrong, but it is massive, so I am not going to get there. But the point being is that in the Amazon, you have areas that are really bad for food production. That is the reality, because the soils are very old and not fertile. You have other areas that are constantly flooded. You have other areas that are actually not that bad for production. And what indigenous peoples have done over thousands of years is create these forests where you have plants that are not there randomly, but that were put there in order for people to just enter and gather and ensure that they have enough food, right? So yeah, so I can look for more information on that subject. One of my favorite books on the Amazon, it is called One River by Wade Davis. It is a beautiful recollection of ethnobotanists in the Amazon and different parts, particularly of Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and a bit of Bolivia. So yeah, that is for me a great start if you're interested in learning more about the Amazon.
So that's fabulous. And actually, I think the community has put together a Slack channel specifically about book recommendations from BioSummit. So I think Eugene has been helping to lead that with some others. Can you guys put the name of the Slack channel into the chat? So you all can add yourselves there if you're interested in recommending or looking at recommended BioSummit books. And actually, Margarita, I know you are also on the Slack too. So we'll get you added to that channel. So whenever you find those resources, you can just drop them into that Slack channel. There it is. Science Book Recommendations is the name. So so please join that and find some more information there. Everybody, we are unfortunately out of time for this segment here, but again, we have a whole nother hour at 2 o'clock Eastern time with Margarita and her colleagues from around the world. So really excited for that. And can we all just give again one more round of just snaps and applause and love for Margarita? Seriously, this was I just so moving and so important. So thank you so much for sharing.